Hi everyone, Kathryn Korostoff here from Research Rockstar. Thanks for joining me again today for another conversation for Research Rockstars. I'm very excited today because I have a very special guest, my friend and colleague Jeffrey Henning. Now, Jeffrey Henning not only is the president of Researchscape International, but you may have read some of his many articles on research methodology. He's an incredible writer and does a lot of research on research. So if you haven't read his articles, you should seek them out. He also speaks at a lot of industry conferences, so perhaps you've seen him speak at various events around the country. What I'd like to do now is just say hello to my good friend Jeffrey and then jump right on in. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, Kathryn. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Excellent. So, Jeffrey, you were very kind to join me for this conversation about something that I had found very inspiring. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times had an article about what was, I thought, a really fascinating case study. A very famous author, a very famous social psychologist named Amy Cuddy, had done some powerful research about 2010 about what she called power poses. This is in the field of social psychology. And according to her research, she had found that by actually having specific physical postures, that people could not only have an impact on how people perceive them, but actually change their own body chemistry. The idea then was by having these so-called postures or power positions or power poses, as I think actually what she called them, that you could actually change your body chemistry and impact how you feel and how you interact with other people. For example, people who might be uncomfortable in business meetings or might not be comfortable with public speaking. The idea is that they would be able to use these power poses, affect their body chemistry, and actually perform better. So it was a really cool piece of research. In fact, she had a best-selling book that talked about it called Presence, and she also has a TED Talk that has over 14 million views, making it one of the most famous TED Talks of all time. But what I found really fascinating was that, according to the New York Times article, around 2014, the whole field of social psychology seemed to have a sort of new and or renewed focus on research validity, research replicability, and probably because her work was so famous, it became sort of a case study for this. So there were people in her field who tried to replicate her research. Well, you know what happened, because I just used the word tried. Unfortunately, they were not successful. So this very high-profile researcher, this very high-profile scientist, Harvard professor, unfortunately, they weren't able to replicate her research. And it caused a big discussion in the field of social psychology about replicability and validity. And as I read that article, I thought to myself, wow, this may have some implications for those of us in other, broadly speaking, social science fields, those of us who do consumer research. So I wrote an article about this and I posted it on LinkedIn. It was called The New York Times Article on Amy Cuddy, Is Survey Research Next? And what I'd love to do, Jeffrey, is talk to you about the article a little bit. And, there are a few points that have come up that you and I have also discussed about, are there potentially some implications that those of us who do research need to know about? So based on that, I came up with 3 questions for us to go through today. So the first question is really just about, is there a negative halo effect? When research from other fields gets negative publicity about its validity, does that cast a negative halo on those of us who do consumer research as well? What do you think, Jeffrey?
Definitely, unfortunately. Obviously, the public opinion research industry, when polling has misses, that reflects badly on us. But given our interest in understanding how consumers react, whenever there's some bad news from psychology, I definitely sometimes get questions about it. And often I'm not as brave as you, Kathryn. I often don't write about misses because I don't want to raise the conversation with my prospects and customers about the fact. And I've seen it kind of break out from psychology to affect many other areas of science now. There's the whole p-value crisis, and people are rethinking, what p-value they should use, and finding replicability issues in many other harder sciences than psychology. So I definitely think that we get caught up in the negative halo.
Yeah, I really agree with you, and it really is concerning for me. I'm glad you brought up some of the other, frankly, high visibility survey failures. I know there were a lot of people who asked me questions after the last presidential election in the United States. You know, how could the polling have been so wrong? And that led to a lot of really interesting conversations, of course. So I'm glad that we have this, so this is a great place to start. So we know that we have to be concerned about perceptions of market research. We know that we want people to feel comfortable that the research we're giving is indeed reliable. You know, one of the things we always complain about in market research is that sometimes we do research projects, we deliver it to a client, and they don't use it. And I do think that one of the things that can be a cause of that is because when we're delivering research, especially research that might in any way be contrary to what the client may have expected, it's really easy to distrust it, right? And now, so they may already be disinclined to trust research that challenges their conventional thinking or their existing points of view. But then on top of that, they're getting evidence that just in general, a lot of research is faulty. So unfortunately, it's something that does concern me, making sure that there are more positive perceptions of research. So we are concerned about this. So one of the things that brings up for me is, are we guilty in survey research of overstating research reliability? You know, we often put forth our survey research. We talk about 95% confidence intervals. We talk about other indications to show that our data is really high quality. But are we overstating reliability of survey research?
You know, that's interesting because I think sometimes being somewhat academic and understanding the math behind it, we might state it in ways that we think have appropriate caveats, but our prospects and customers don't interpret it that way because they're not thinking of it that way. So when you say the margin of error, you know, is plus or minus 4% at 95% confidence, there's a number of things that they don't understand about that. One, they don't understand that if you ask 20 questions, that means one of them, the answer might have no relation to, to reality. It could be widely off outside that margin. So that's something that they forget. That is true of probability sampling, which I'm able to do with e-commerce clients who know all their transactions, but most organizations are working in messier worlds where they don't know everybody. So right there, it doesn't work. And then we go to it because it's easy to calculate, but it's only one type of error. It doesn't look into non-sampling error, leading questions, other issues. And it doesn't even get into things like purchase likelihood models, or to your example about the polls, likely voter models. So people want certainty, and so they turn to it for that certainty, but unfortunately, they're not understanding that it's in some ways a false summary of the accuracy of a survey.
I'm really glad you made a couple of those points. One of the things that I really am interested in, and there's been so many wonderful articles, of course, in the last couple of years, is the implications of doing non-probability sampling, which a lot of market research projects do have. That's just a reality for a lot of market researchers. So when we're using non-probability samples, what actually can we conclude with some of our statistics? Because some statistics assume that you are working with a probability sample. So we do know that there are some challenges there. So, but you know, I think also for people who may not do market research all the time or may be a little removed from it, you know, I want to make sure that when we are talking about the research validity, that we have a way, and maybe this is something that we just need to be doing better as a profession, but I do wish there was a way that we could consistently and really, really a simple way communicate that no research is perfect. You know, there's no data source that's perfect. There's no research that's perfect. It doesn't mean that all survey research is bad. It's just that we have to understand what some of the risks are. And with that, I'm going to move to our third question. So let's talk about that. What are some of the risk factors in survey research that reduce likely replicability and validity? You know, I actually want to take a minute on this point of replicability because, you know, the idea is that we always talk about research being, you know, looking for accuracy in research. And of course, one of the ideas is that research should be replicable. If I did the same research using the same instrument with the same sample, I should get the same results within a certain margin of error. So we do look at replicability as a key way of understanding whether or not our instruments, that is our questionnaires, are doing a good job for us. So what are some of the risk factors that can hurt the replicability and overall validity of survey research? I'd love to get your opinion on this, Jeffrey.
Well, I think one of the big risk factors these days is the sampling problem. I mean, when I started in the industry, we would randomly dial people in the US. 98% of Americans had a landline telephone. We'd say who in the household had the most recent birthday or has the next birthday, so we'd randomly get someone in the house. And then we could extrapolate from that. The last probability survey I did, telephone survey, it looked like there was no one in the country under the age of 30. Because they don't have landlines. So we've had to instead go to models based on sampling, and it's hard to be consistent. Even if you have a partner that you've used many times, how they're recruiting, the makeup of their panel is changing over time. And so, most of our tracking studies have been pretty steady, but we did have one in January where the results were very different, and we traced it back to changes in sampling, which is something that often happens outside of our visibility. So the other issue is, it's funny to me because researchers will often sort of declaim do-it-yourself researchers and their lack of appreciation for the fine points. And yet I see many professional researchers write very bad questionnaires with very naive understanding of how people answer surveys. And so badly worded questions, assuming that people can recall fine details about past purchases, how much they spent on something. Bad question wording, I think, often, and an assumption that what they're saying is what they're thinking, not factoring in any of the behavioral economics, which I know you've done a lot of research on, also reduces the validity of the findings.
Those are all awesome points. Thank you so much. And I am one of the things that I'm really passionate about is that you touched on is, of course, the question wording and, of course, use of scales. So in survey research, of course, we have a lot of different scales that we can use, and there's always been debate and discussion, but there's also research on research about what types of scales are more or less effective. And scale validity is actually a really important concept that I feel gets ignored or doesn't get enough attention. And one of the ways I see that coming up is that I see surveys where people are clearly winging it in terms of their scales. They're asking a question and they're creating these, please rate this on a 7-point scale from A to B, where A is makes me want to dance in the street, and D is makes me want to curl up in a ball. People are trying to be creative. Okay, that was extreme, but I've seen some pretty crazy scales out there, and what I don't think people appreciate is that the way we word scales is actually really important, because we need to be sure that all the people who are taking your questionnaire are interpreting those scales pretty much consistently. Right? We're trying to get some sort of consistent measure. And while their opinions may vary, we need to make sure that their use of the scale is consistent. And so actually one of my favorite resources, I'm just going to show this here, is the Handbook of Marketing Scales. This is a really great book. It's got hundreds of tested scales, and they actually talk about the validity testing for each of those scales. So it's really important to remember that we don't just make up scales. We should really be using scales that have been tested for validity so that we can make sure that we are getting accurate measures. And while I appreciate that it can be fun to make up your own scales, if we're doing that and we don't have any sense of the validity of that scale and whether or not it's going to gather consistent information or consistent measurements, how do I interpret that data? It might be a fun survey, but I'm not sure it's a survey whose results I'm going to want to use for any real business decision making. So I'm a big fan of using tested scales, although of course you can also test your own scales if you want to make that investment in time. So
those are great points, and I think we all need a little more humility about our own questionnaires and getting more people to help us improve them, and just thinking about there's plenty of research on research that happens in an academic setting that we don't apply in the commercial MR world, and so we should not do things just because we've always done them that way, but keep up with the academic literature.
Yeah, I confess I really love the Journal of Marketing Research. They publish a lot of awesome research on research. I confess I don't read it as frequently as I should. I do try to make a point of reading it at least a few times a year, but they often have some really good things. And on a more humorous angle, there's a Twitter account. I'm sure you've seen this. It's Market Research Shame.
Yes.
Have you seen that? I have to find out who's behind it. It's kind of posted as anonymous, just MRX Shame. So that's on Twitter. And if you are interested in seeing funny examples of bad questionnaire design, this Twitter account does a lovely job of shaming people about their bad research. So it's raises awareness and is also quite amusing. Hey, Jeffrey, this was something that you and I also talked about briefly when we were talking about research validity. Can you speak to this for a minute?
Yeah, so I think from a more formal perspective, when we talk about reliability and validity, so we'll often do tracking studies that are highly reliable even at small sample studies, small sample sizes. So if they're shots on target, they're consistent in that first picture, but they're not hitting the target. And so that's where can you compare it to other research, the CRM database, for instance, to try to figure out how valid it is. The second example is valid. If you average those all out, they hit the bullseye, but no particular one did, and they're all over the place. And then the other one, is neither reliable nor valid. And then the final one is kind of the Robin Hood one, where everything's in the target. And the tough challenge, I think, for a lot of us is we're researching items for our clients that haven't been researched before. So, and we often have a limited budget. So we might be surveying, we did a survey recently of 100 petrochemical engineers. We're not going to get a chance to do a narrow audience like that very often. So, we take our best shot, and in that case, we don't even have a way to measure, did we hit the target? Are we off? It was a one-off project. So we have to follow all of our best practices, and then we kind of take this shot in the dark and hope it was right. And it's much easier on the consumer side, where you're able to repeat studies more often. It's a much more affordable sample and so forth. But on the B2B side, you really have to make sure that you're doing everything to the best of your ability.
That's fantastic. And I confess I've done B2B studies where the only thing I did to do any kind of validation was actually qualitative, just doing a handful of in-depth interviews afterwards with some of my participants, just as a way of kind of getting to hear, a little bit, peel the onion a little bit and make sure I'm interpreting things correctly.
Yeah, and I think qualitative is a great point, right? Because there's plenty of good qualitative research that we learn from and leverage and make decisions from, with the understanding that it's qualitative. And so there's certain times where we just have to recognize that while this was a quantitative methodology, the results might be directional.
I really love that point. We talk a lot about quantitative versus qualitative these days, and something could look quantitative because of the way that we collected it, but we may not actually want to treat it as if it's, something that we can extrapolate to a broader population. So fantastic. Thank you. So we talked about a couple of things today, and thank you so much, Jeffrey, for joining me. I am fascinated by seeing how things that go on in adjacent fields like social psychology may have an impact on how people perceive our field. So I'm just really concerned about making sure that as a profession that we're doing everything we can to be transparent, make it easy for people to understand survey reliability. Survey research is awesome. I've been doing it for almost 30 years. I love survey research, but of course it's not perfect. And some survey research is really not perfect. I want to make sure that we're helping people sort of be transparent about it and think about what they can do in their own work to make sure their research is as valid as possible. So thank you for joining me today. And I do also want to let folks know that actually Jeffrey is going to be teaching a course here at Research Rockstar in January. And I'm really excited about this because it's about an important topic. It's about Net Promoter Score and customer experience research. And the course isn't yet up at the training store at training.researchrockstar.com, but it will be up in a couple of weeks. But save the dates. The class is going to be on January 17th and the 24th from 1 to 2:30 Eastern. Jeffrey, anything else we should say about this course before we wrap it up?
Well, actually, it ties into our sort of joint passion for good scales, because they've tested a lot of other scales that are more reliable than the NPS scale. But NPS, for whatever reason, is it's sort of lodged in CEOs' brains as the measure that they want to use. So we often have to be able to report it to CEOs while actually doing other things that are going to be more constructive for the day-to-day work of improving the customer experience. So it's an interesting hybrid. And your comment about 30 years. So this is my 31st 30th year anniversary in the industry. I was a teenage market researcher.
That's
So,
fantastic, Jeffrey. Congratulations.
So, thank you. So, and the great thing about it, for those of you newer to the field, is, and hopefully you get that sense from Kathryn and I, is there's constantly new things to learn. So, there's always something new to learn. So, who knows? Maybe we'll do another 30 years.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. And if you want more information about Research Rockstar courses, they are available to view at training.researchrockstar.com. You can view our entire course catalog there, including our Insights Association certificate programs. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can always follow me on Twitter at ResearchRocks, or here is also my email address. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.